Greetings from Tokyo. I hope you're well. At the suggestion of one of the viewers, Matt from Neon Nights, I thought I'd talk really briefly about some other horror film series that I happen to have on Blu-ray or DVD. So, Matt, thank you very much for your really great suggestions as always. I really appreciate it. I hope you're well. Um, so let me begin by talking about this one, which is a pretty important series, at least as far as my sort of horror film watching goes, ever since I was a kid. And it's this series. So this is the Arrow video release of the Hellraiser series, parts 1, 2, and 3. So this is in the Scarlet Box, which is a kind of it has the films and it has the extra features, and a lot of supplementary material. It's very interesting. This is the North American release. So this is not the British release. This is the North American release, Region A discs on Blu-ray. And the Hellraiser series is a pretty, I mean, yeah, I'm not, to be perfectly frank, I don't like any of the films from 3 onward, I'm sorry to say. I wish I did. I know a lot of work goes into these films, and I know that they are dealing with a lot of very interesting concepts in terms of how to present horror stories in a way that defies the usual film cliche. I think films like Hellraiser Inferno, I think Hellraiser 4, the one where he goes to space. I think those are really, I think they have some interesting concepts in them. And even Hellraiser 3, I think, is a pretty, it's not a terrible film by any stretch of the imagination. However, it's just so difficult when you have such high caliber films as we do in the first 2 entries of the Hellraiser saga, as it were. That's the first Hellraiser film and Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. Now, those are top of the line, successful, cream of the crop, creme de la creme, the best of the best. You can't get any better than that. You've got a wonderful film that is a wonderful, frightening, low budget horror treat wrapped in a nice little package. It's its own hermetically sealed story, but it's so fascinating and wonderful that it can go in any direction. When you finish it, you think, my goodness, where can they go next? And in fact, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 takes it to a completely different level, and it expands the universe in a way that is really mysterious and still foreboding and shocking and challenging. That's what great sequels ought to do, right? Is to challenge you and to provoke you and still keep alive the same sense of atmosphere and dread that was so successful in the first film. So that's why you have Hellraiser 1, Hellraiser 2 being so good, and thus all the other films that follow are just trying their best to be on the level with those films. And it's really hard when you have 2 masterpieces like that. So, yes, so Hellraiser was a film that I saw that was released in the late 80s, so I was still a kid back then. And the poster scared me. It was the poster with Pinhead's face on the front, and it had the tagline, we will tear your soul apart, which was wonderful. And what was great about Hellraiser was that they weren't even the villains. The Cenobites were not the proper villains of that piece. The proper villains are Frank and Julia, and what great villains they are too. I mean, they really propel the story in a way that is so, dare I say, relatable. They're just acting on their human urges, right? They just wanted to get together, or at least Frank was had for whatever reason, he was a womanizer, and he was into Julia, and Julia was really into Frank, and so that kind of unholy alliance, as it were, led to sort of interesting results. And excuse me, um, then you have Kirsty, as a kind of a doe-eyed innocent, and thrown into the mix, you have the father, and you have the Cenobites, and you have this really sort of interesting, perverted, twisted story, based on sort of sexual perversions and um, sort of the appetite of wanting to know more. There's a religious bent to that twisted tale. There's also the sense of sadomasochism, and there is also a great sense of world building, the creation of new myth. You have to remember that this was still at a time when we were seeing a lot of new characters crop up, from the late 70s onwards, and they lasted through the 80s and into the 90s. And Hellraiser came sort of near the tail end of that series. From the late 70s on, you had Michael Myers and the Friday the 13th series, and then maybe in the early 80s you had Nightmare on Elm Street, etc. And now in the late 80s we're getting other sort of horror icons, as it were, with Chucky or maybe Candyman, etc. So the Hellraiser series started in that tail end of the 80s. So maybe some people might think it's sort of the beginning of the end of the golden age of slasher and horror films. Despite coming relatively late in the game, the Cenobites and the lead Cenobite, affectionately known as Pinhead, have such a lasting impression. They have really lasted. They are really perhaps amongst the most beautiful horror creations in the history of horror cinema, in my opinion. Just the design of the lead Cenobite and female Cenobite, Chatterer, Butterball. I mean, those four just standing there in that hotel, in the hospital room when they're talking to Kirsty, is just so remarkable. They don't move. All they do is just stand there, and they're just moving very slowly. You don't see them move very quickly. They just stand and speak and stare. That's it. And yet it is so hypnotic what they do. And they don't appear in the film very long, but when they do appear, you just can't take your eyes off of them. Just beautiful designs, wonderful designs, the Cenobites are. And I think that power alone is what makes Hellraiser such a masterpiece. Then you combine that with the sort of the dirty, sleazy story of Frank and Julia, and resurrected from the dead, and Julia giving him blood and flesh of her victims, etc., in order so that she can fulfill her lusts, right? And she wants to consummate her desires. She wants to have sex with this guy, and it's so sort of understandable and relatable on a very human base level. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful film. Hellraiser 2, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2 takes it to the next level. You have the creation of a mythology and a whole world. We go into hell. It's a lot of dusty corridors and a big kind of maze of some sort, at the center of which is this huge Leviathan, which, I don't know, it might not necessarily be the most overwhelming design in the world, but I appreciate what the concept was, or at least what they're trying to go for. And then you have the expansion of the mystery and the history of the lead Cenobite, and you also have the other Cenobites' backgrounds explored, and you have a kind of a sense of how Cenobites are created. We see firsthand how one Cenobite is created, Dr. Chenard. What a wonderful design really gross and frightening, and that huge penis that grabs him by the head and just does its thing. It's a really inventive design, I must say. And oh yes, and very briefly, I should also mention the music by Christopher Young. Those two films scores, the soundtracks are just utterly sublime, utterly sublime. Probably amongst my favorite movie soundtracks. Those two. Yeah, well, I can't even distinguish between the two. I think they're equally brilliant. Yes, so just very quickly, that's Hellraiser 1 and Hellraiser 2, just utter masterpieces. Now, the rest of the films in this Hellraiser franchise, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to like them very much. And, starting with Hellraiser 3, I'm trying to like it. Um, yeah, it's what's the name of the actress? Terry Farrell, I think. She plays, what's her name? Joey Summerskill. Not She's a likable enough character, I suppose, but not as compelling as Kirsty. And there's not as much drive to it. There's, I think, kinky, sleazy aspect to it. There's a really, there's some nice, like, sex scenes in it and some violence in it that's really inventive. But on the whole, I say it's a little bit too much Pinhead for my tastes. I prefer a little less Pinhead, a little more of the human horror. And so they're trying to make Pinhead into like a Freddy Krueger or some kind of wise crack. Well, he doesn't crack wise, I suppose. He just gives off all these sort of erudite sounding lines of dialogue, which I think is a little bit overblown. But and there's also something off with his makeup. Hellraiser 3's makeup is a little bit off. I don't know. It doesn't feel consistent with the makeup of the first two. The makeup from the third film onward is a little bit. Yeah, I could never get over the fact that there was so much inconsistency in the makeup between Hellraisers 1 and 2 on the one hand and Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth on the other. But there are some things about Hellraiser 3 that are likable. Um, I think the first half of the film I think is really spectacular, or as spectacular as it can be, I suppose. The idea of of Pinhead taunting these people trying to get out of the pillar, and he's very hypnotic and he's very charming. And the performance by Doug Bradley is quite impressive. He plays the dual roles, Pinhead on the one hand and Elliot Spencer, right, on the other. I think some of that storyline about the dual um, personalities, I think, is a little bit maybe undercooked. I think it could have been maybe developed a little bit more, maybe thought out a little bit more to sort of give us a further sense of why this paradoxical dual existences came about. I still don't quite know what the link is between Hellraiser 2 and then Hellraiser 3. But, in the end, you're not supposed to think too deeply about those sorts of details, I suppose. And yes, I appreciate also the fact that Hellraiser 3 was trying to give us more Cenobites. And I think that's fine because, as a viewer of Hellraiser, I love the Cenobites and I love each of the Cenobites' respective designs. But yeah, the camera coming out, the whatever, or the CDs and the I don't quite know what that thing is in the guy's head, right? It comes out and it does a little thing. I don't know. I like the smoking one. I thought that was kind of cute, but it was a little bit too derivative of female Cenobite. And there's also the one with the fat guy with the barbed wire around his face. I thought that was a little bit too derivative of Butterball. So yes, so I appreciate the effort made in trying to create new Cenobites, though I find the end results a little bit disappointing, but not so much so that I'll give the third film a complete thumbs down. I think it I give it an A for effort. I think that's as far as I'll give credit to that film. But and as far as the other films, I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk too much more about those because I don't I don't have them, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know them as well as I do the films in this box. So please forgive me for not mentioning those anymore. So yes, so that's my view very briefly in a very truncated way. That's my take on the Hellraiser series, but it's a very short take, so I don't want to spend too much more time. Believe me, I could spend hours talking about the first two films alone, but I won't. Except to say that if you want to talk more about Hellraiser and or anything else Hellraiser related, or if you have any other bits of information you want to share with me, I'd love to hear it. And yes, as always, you can leave a comment below, or you can try to reach me on Facebook. I love talking about this stuff. And anyone who's very enthusiastic about the Hellraiser series, especially the later ones, I'd love to hear your comments. Again, maybe it's the enthusiasm of people like you that can convince me and help me to understand and appreciate the values and the merits that exist in these later Hellraiser films. And I know they do exist. I'm not trying to put them down immediately, but yes, I need help trying to appreciate those. So if those of you out there who feel that way about those films, let me know. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Anyway, thank you very much, and have a pleasant rest of your day. Thank you.